In the dense jungles of Vietnam, a secret special operations group, known as Ghost Squad, encountered something beyond the ordinary horrors of war. This elite team, led by Captain Michael Stone, was sent deep into enemy territory with a mission to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Unknown to them, their insertion point was not just a strategic military target but also a place steeped in dark, ancient secrets. The mission began under the cloak of night as the squad was airlifted near the border. The men, equipped with the latest technology and weapons, felt confident yet tense as they rappelled into the thick foliage. The jungle swallowed them whole, the sounds of wildlife and the rustle of leaves underfoot masking their movements. As they moved deeper, the team's radio man, Private Jenkins, began to pick up strange interference on his equipment. Static filled the airwaves, interspersed with what sounded like whispers in a language none of the team recognized. Thinking it was just a technical glitch, they pressed on, but the interference grew stronger, more insistent. On the second night, as they camped near a narrow river, the squad's medic, Corporal Thompson, reported seeing figures moving in the shadows. He claimed they were not VC soldiers but something else, shadows that seemed to flicker and vanish when looked at directly. The team joked about his overactive imagination, but his insistence troubled them. The next day, they stumbled upon an abandoned village. The huts were dilapidated, covered in overgrowth, and long deserted, but the place felt alive. Eyes seemed to watch them from the empty windows, and an oppressive sense of dread hung over the area. Captain Stone, feeling uneasy, ordered a quick sweep for intelligence and supplies. Inside one of the huts, Sergeant Ramirez found a shrine with an effigy made of bones and feathers. The ground was littered with old, brittle bones, and markings were etched into the dirt floor, a language that resembled no known scripts. As they examined the scene, the whispers Jenkins had heard over the radio returned, louder this time, and seemingly coming from the effigy itself. Ignoring the ominous signs, they took photos and collected samples, intending to bring them back for analysis. That night, the disturbances escalated. The camp was plagued by sounds of whispering and crying. The foliage around them seemed to rustle with the movement of unseen creatures, and several tripwires were triggered, yet nothing was ever caught in the flares they shot into the canopy. Driven by a mounting sense of paranoia and fear, the squad pushed on, aiming to reach a rendezvous point on the fourth day. However, as they navigated through a particularly dense part of the jungle, Private Lewis suddenly screamed and collapsed, clutching his head. When they rushed to his aid, he was feverish, babbling about voices that demanded his return to the village. That evening, as they tried to calm Lewis, the jungle around them seemed to close in. The air grew thick, and a fog rolled in from the river, enveloping them in a dense mist. Visibility dropped, and the radios malfunctioned completely, cutting them off from any contact with the outside world. In the fog, figures began to emerge, silhouettes of soldiers from different eras, each appearing battle-worn and lost. They circled the camp, whispering of battles long past and horrors unseen. Captain Stone, trying to maintain order, set up a defensive perimeter, but the figures melted into the mist as quickly as they appeared. By morning, Private Lewis was gone. His equipment lay by his sleeping bag, neatly arranged as if he had never intended to return. A search revealed tracks leading back towards the village, but they disappeared just as the jungle began to clear. The squad, now thoroughly shaken, debated their next move. Captain Stone decided they must follow, both to recover their man and to understand what was happening. As they retraced their steps, the jungle seemed to change. Paths they had marked were no longer there, and landmarks seemed subtly altered. They found the village again, but it was different, more intact, as if it had been waiting for them. The shrine now bore fresh offerings, and the effigy's eyes seemed to follow them as they moved. The whispers were now clear, calling them by name, beckoning them closer. The story leaves off as the squad, led by a determined yet terrified Captain Stone, prepares to enter the village once more, driven by a desperate need to find their missing comrade and confront the dark forces that haunt this place. As they step forward, the jungle holds its breath, the silence a heavy weight, the shadows deepening as if in anticipation of the revelations to come. As Captain Stone and his team approached the village once more, the air seemed to thicken, becoming oppressive and heavy, as if imbued with the weight of unseen eyes watching their every step. The once familiar sounds of the jungle were now eerily absent, replaced by a silence that felt almost suffocating. The village, which they had left in ruins, now stood strangely pristine. The huts, previously dilapidated and overrun by the jungle, appeared newly constructed, the thatched roofs intact and the walls solid and unblemished. This impossible restoration only heightened the squad's sense of dread, the unnaturalness of the scene before them sending chills down their spines. Sergeant Ramirez, his hand firmly on his rifle, whispered, "This isn't right, sir. It's like we've stepped into another time, or another world." Captain Stone, his eyes scanning the shadows between the huts, nodded silently, his mind racing to make sense of the situation. He knew they were dealing with forces beyond their comprehension, but his resolve to find Private Lewis and protect his men hardened his will. As they moved cautiously into the village, the ground beneath their feet felt unnaturally soft, the earth seeming to pulse with a slow, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the jungle itself. The air was filled with a faint aroma of incense and decay, a scent that seemed to seep into their clothes and skin, marking them as intruders in this forgotten place. The shrine, which Sergeant Ramirez had previously investigated, now bore candles that flickered as though recently lit, their flames casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The effigy, its eyes hollow yet seemingly alive, watched them with an intensity that suggested awareness and intent. Corporal Thompson, his voice barely a whisper, said, "Do you hear that?" The others stopped, listening intently. A low hum, almost imperceptible, filled the air, a sound like chanting coming from all around them, yet its source was nowhere to be seen. As they ventured deeper into the village, the chanting grew louder, more insistent. Figures began to materialize in the periphery of their vision, ghostly apparitions of soldiers from various eras, their forms blurry and distorted, as if viewed through water. These spectral warriors bore wounds of battles long past, their eyes empty of life yet filled with an unspeakable sorrow. The team, encircled by these apparitions, felt a growing sense of panic. Their training had prepared them for enemy combatants, not for the phantoms of fallen soldiers. Yet, as these figures drew closer, an unspoken understanding passed between them. These were the souls of those lost to the jungle's ancient curse, bound to the very soil they had died upon. Private Davis, the squad's youngest member, stumbled backward, his foot catching on a root. As he fell, the earth beneath him shifted, revealing a shallow grave. Skeletal remains, clothed in tattered uniforms, lay intertwined, their bones entwined with the roots of the jungle. His scream shattered the haunting silence, prompting the ghostly soldiers to advance with renewed urgency. Captain Stone rallied his men, "Form up. Protect Davis!" As they formed a tight circle around the private, the apparitions halted, their forms shimmering in the dim light, and a voice, deep and resonant, emerged from the effigy. "You trespass upon the resting place of the Forsaken," it boomed, echoing through the clearing. "Leave now, or remain here forever, as guardians of the forgotten." The team was at a crossroads, the threat of eternal entrapment hanging over them like a dark shroud. Captain Stone, weighing their slim chances of survival against the duty to recover their lost comrade, made a decision. "We move forward," he commanded, his voice firm despite the trembling uncertainty he felt inside. "We find Lewis and uncover the truth of this place." As they advanced towards the center of the village, where the chanting now resonated with the force of a storm, the ground beneath them continued to shift unnaturally, as if the very earth were alive, reacting to their every move. The ghostly soldiers parted to allow them passage, their faces etched with sorrow and warning. The path led to a larger hut, its doorway draped with vines that moved as if breathing. Inside, the glow of numerous candles revealed an altar more elaborate than any they had seen, and there, bound by vines that seemed to grow from the very ground itself, was Private Lewis. His eyes were wide open, filled with terror and confusion as he recognized his team. "Captain," he rasped, his voice weak, "it's all true, everything." As the team approached to free him, the hut began to close in around them, the walls pulsating with a life of their own. The story pauses here, with Echo Team confronting the living heart of the jungle, unsure of whether they will save their friend or succumb to the same mysterious forces holding him captive. The vines that ensnared Private Lewis tightened, pulsing with a sinister energy as if they were alive and aware of the team's intentions. Captain Stone, his resolve unwavering, directed his men to form a perimeter around the altar. "We need to extract him now," he ordered, his voice cutting through the eerie hum that filled the hut. The men moved quickly, their trained hands working to untangle the thick vines that bound their comrade, but with each vine they cut, another seemed to grow back in its place, as if the jungle itself was resisting their efforts. As they struggled, the air in the hut grew thick and hot, almost suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening, forming shapes that whispered of ancient rites and forgotten wars. The candles flickered wildly, casting unsettling shadows that danced across the mud walls, transforming the hut into a realm of shifting illusions. Corporal Thompson, who was trying to calm Lewis, noticed something peculiar about the vines. "Sir, these aren't just growing back, they're reacting to us. It's like they're alive." His observation confirmed Stone's worst fears, that they were not just fighting a physical battle but one against a living, breathing entity, the jungle itself. Sergeant Ramirez, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the hut, muttered, "It's like we're inside the belly of some beast." And indeed, the hut did feel like an organism, with each candle that sputtered and died resembling a neuron flickering out in a vast, dark brain. The chanting outside grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of voices that were both human and otherworldly. The spectral soldiers that had followed them to the hut began to fade in and out of existence, their outlines blurring as if they were being erased by the thickening air. Private Davis, while assisting in the extraction effort, glanced outside the hut's doorway and saw that the jungle appeared to be moving closer, the trees and plants swaying rhythmically, encroaching on the small clearing where the hut stood. "Captain, the jungle, it's like it's closing in on us," he shouted over the noise. Ignoring the growing danger, Captain Stone focused on freeing Lewis. He knew that their time was running out, not just to save their friend but to escape the tightening grip of the jungle. "Keep cutting," he yelled, "and watch the walls." As they worked, Lewis, his voice hoarse and trembling, began to speak deliriously about what he had seen while captured. "They showed me visions, wars, death, sacrifices. This place is cursed, built on a grave, a mass grave." His words trailed off into incoherent mumblings, but they chilled the squad to their core. Meanwhile, the entity controlling the vines seemed to grow more desperate, the hut shaking with its fury. The ground beneath them trembled, and small fissures opened up, emitting a foul, earthy smell. The very atmosphere was thick with a sense of impending doom. Then, in a desperate act of defiance, Captain Stone grabbed a torch from the wall and thrust it into the massive vines at the altar's base. The flames caught quickly, spreading up the tendrils with surprising ferocity. The hut filled with the smell of burning vegetation, and the vines writhed and shrieked, an unholy sound that merged human agony with the wrath of nature. The fire seemed to weaken the entity momentarily, and the vines loosened their grip on Lewis. Seizing the opportunity, the team redoubled their efforts. With a final push, they freed Lewis, pulling him away from the altar just as the hut began to collapse around them. They retreated out of the burning hut into the encroaching jungle, which now seemed to recoil from the light of the fire. Carrying Lewis, who was weak but alive, they ran towards the clearing where they had entered the village. Behind them, the flames engulfed the hut, casting a bright, defiant light against the creeping darkness. The jungle around them was alive with movement, not just from the fire but from the angry, mournful cries of the jungle itself. The trees shook, and the ground heaved as if in pain, the entity wounded but not vanquished. As they reached the clearing, the team realized the battle was far from over. The jungle was regrouping, the darkness gathering strength for another assault. Captain Stone looked back at the burning village, the flames reflecting in his determined eyes. "We've won this battle," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos, "but the war continues." The story pauses here, with Echo Team momentarily safe but still deep within the heart of an enemy that is not just physical but spiritual, ancient, and deeply rooted in the very earth itself. Their fight for survival is far from over, as they stand on the precipice of unknown terrors, their escape route as treacherous as the entity they have just combated. The clearing around them seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the trees bending inward, forming a barrier that felt almost deliberate. Captain Stone, his eyes scanning for any path that might lead them back to safety, realized that the jungle itself was the labyrinth, and they were its unwilling prisoners. "Move out, stay sharp, and keep close," Stone commanded, his voice a calm force in the midst of the encroaching darkness. The team, their bodies weary but spirits fueled by adrenaline, moved as one, their steps quick and silent on the leaf-covered ground. As they navigated through the dense undergrowth, the remnants of the village's destruction echoed behind them, cracks and pops of burning wood, the hiss of extinguished flames, and the mournful wails of the jungle. The entity, though weakened, was still very much alive, its presence felt in the oppressive air and the watchful eyes of nocturnal creatures that followed their progress with an unsettling interest. The deeper they went, the more disoriented they became. The jungle seemed to shift around them, familiar landmarks disappearing, replaced by an ever-changing landscape that defied their maps and their memories. It was as if the forest itself was reshaping, driven by a will to trap them within its confines. Private Jenkins, his hand tightly gripping his rifle, whispered, "It's like it's alive, like we're walking through the belly of some giant beast." His words, meant to be hushed, carried through the team, heightening the sense of dread that clung to them like the humid air. Suddenly, Sergeant Ramirez halted, his fist raised in a silent command to stop. Ahead, the trees had formed a tight circle, their branches interlocking to create a wall of wood and leaves. In the center of this natural amphitheater, a pool of water reflected the moonlight, its surface smooth and undisturbed. Captain Stone approached the pool, his instincts warning him of danger, yet compelled by a need to understand. As he peered into the water, the reflection showed not his own face but glimpses of battles past and future, scenes of violence and suffering that spanned the ages, each wave rippling across the water revealing another layer of human cruelty and supernatural wrath. The team gathered around, watching in horror as the images shifted, faster and faster, until with a sudden stillness, the pool cleared, and the reflection settled on their own images. Only, behind each man stood the spectral soldiers they had seen in the village, their ghostly hands resting on the soldiers' shoulders. A low rumble filled the air, a sound both from above and below, as the earth trembled and the trees swayed. The entity was not just a guardian of the past, it was an echo of the eternal battle between human folly and the elemental forces of nature. "We need to leave. Now." Captain Stone's command snapped them out of their trance, and they backed away from the pool, the ghostly images dissipating into the mist that began to rise from the ground. As they retreated, the jungle's response was swift. Vines whipped out, blocking their path, and trees bent to obstruct their way. The air grew colder, a chill that seeped into their bones, a stark contrast to the tropical heat they had endured. With every step, the squad's desperation grew. The path that had brought them here was lost, replaced by a maze of vegetation that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. They were not merely lost, they were ensnared, caught in a web woven by the jungle itself. The final scene unfolds as Echo Team, surrounded by the closing grip of the jungle, realizes the full horror of their situation. They are part of a cycle, a never-ending loop of conflict and retribution, pawns in a game as old as the land itself. Captain Stone, his face set in grim determination, turns to his men, his voice barely a whisper against the howling wind. "This isn't just about survival anymore," he says, the shadows of the ghostly soldiers looming over them in the dim light. "It's about breaking the cycle. We fight not to escape, but to end this. The story ends here, with Echo Team standing defiant in the heart of the jungle, the darkness closing in, their fate uncertain but their resolve unbroken. They are ready to face whatever horrors await, to either break the curse or become part of its legacy. Worst things I saw in war, true military and amp, war horror stories. In the sweltering heat of a nondescript Middle Eastern town, a unit of elite soldiers, known as Echo Team, was deployed under the cover of darkness. The team, led by Captain James Erickson, was tasked with a high-risk mission to capture a notorious warlord accused of heinous war crimes. The town, once vibrant and bustling, now lay in ruins, a ghost of its former self, marred by the scars of war. The mission commenced under an ominous crescent moon. As Echo Team silently moved through the narrow, debris-littered streets, the silence was punctuated only by the distant echoes of warfare and their own measured footsteps. Their target was located in an old government building at the town's edge, which intelligence reports suggested was being used as the warlord's base of operations. As they approached the building, the air was thick with tension. Suddenly, the ground shook violently underfoot, an explosion nearby. Instinctively, the team took cover, hearts racing as dust and smoke billowed around them. When the dust settled, they found themselves unscathed, but the explosion was a clear sign that their presence was known. Continuing their approach, Captain Erickson signaled his team to split up, entering the building from different points to maximize their chances of securing the target. As James and his subgroup, consisting of Sergeant Lewis and Private Connors, made their way through a side entrance, they were met with an eerie silence that belied the recent chaos. Inside, the building was a labyrinth of hallways and rooms, each corner promising potential danger. Their night vision goggles cast an otherworldly green glow, revealing the grim reality of their surroundings, walls pocked with bullet holes and floors strewn with the remnants of a hasty evacuation. As they cleared each room, the stories of the warlord's brutalities whispered through the cracked walls. Civilians and soldiers alike had been subjected to unthinkable horrors here. It was in a small, dimly lit room that Echo Team came across the first grim sign of recent atrocities, a makeshift torture chamber, complete with blood-stained tools and chains hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay. Shaken but resolute, they continued, each step taking them deeper into the heart of darkness. It was Sergeant Lewis who first heard the faint cries. Following the sound, they discovered a hidden basement beneath the building. Inside, they found civilians, men, women, and children, imprisoned in cages like animals. Their eyes, wide with fear, bore silent testimony to the horrors they had endured. The rescue of the civilians was swift, but the mission was far from over. The warlord was still at large, and now aware of Echo Team's presence. As they prepared to move deeper into the building, a sudden realization struck Captain Erickson. This was no ordinary military operation. They had stumbled upon a den of supernatural horror. The walls seemed to pulsate with a life of their own, and shadows moved independently of their sources. The air grew colder, and the dim lights flickered as if struggling against an unseen force. The team, trained for combat and survival, found themselves facing an enemy they had never anticipated. As they ascended to the upper floors, the building seemed to react, with doors slamming shut and inexplicable sounds filling the air. Whispers of the dead and the damned echoed through the halls, telling tales of sorrow and begging for release from their eternal torment. In a large, ornate room, they finally confronted the warlord, a man who seemed less human and more a manifestation of war itself. His eyes, hollow and unseeing, stared through them as if peering into their very souls. The confrontation was brief but intense, with gunfire and shouts piercing the supernatural silence. However, as the warlord fell, the building's ominous energies did not dissipate but grew stronger. The walls began to bleed, and the shadows twisted into grotesque shapes, threatening to engulf them in darkness. Captain Erickson realized that they were dealing with something far beyond the scope of their mission, a malevolent force unleashed by the atrocities committed within these walls. With the warlord dead, they needed to evacuate immediately, but as they turned to leave, the building seemed to warp and shift, disorienting them and blocking their paths with debris. Each corridor turned into a maze, and every exit seemed to lead them further into the depths of the building. As the story draws to a close, Echo Team, led by Captain Erickson, finds themselves trapped in a haunted war zone, their escape routes obscured by the building's malevolent intent. The horrors they witnessed are etched into their minds, and the true nature of their enemy, both human and supernatural, threatens their very sanity. The story leaves off with Echo Team radioing for extraction, desperately seeking a way out, but as they wait for a response, the shadows around them grow denser, more aggressive, and an ominous whispering fills the air. The building itself seems to pulsate with a sinister life, its very structure contorting and creaking as if in pain. As the radio crackles to life with a distant voice promising extraction, the connection breaks and plunges them back into a terrifying silence. Captain Erickson, his face set in grim determination, leads his team through the increasingly hostile environment. The walls, slick with unexplained moisture, seem to close in on them. Floorboards groan underfoot, each step a perilous venture into unknown horrors. The air grows colder, breaths visible in the beam of their flashlights, which flicker sporadically as if being drained by the darkness itself. The team encounters increasingly disturbing phenomena. Mirrors hang on the walls, not shattered by the conflict outside but intact and oddly pristine. However, the reflections shown are twisted and distorted, not mirroring their true forms but revealing ghastly versions of themselves, faces marred by deep, dark eyes, mouths twisted in silent screams. Despite the urge to look away, there's a mesmerizing quality to these reflections, as if they are showing not just possible forms, but their deepest fears and horrors made manifest. Sergeant Lewis, usually unshakable, murmurs under his breath about eyes watching from the shadows, voices whispering his name. Private Connors, the youngest and most impressionable of the group, clutches his rifle tightly, jumping at every sound. The psychological strain is palpable, each man grappling with his own creeping dread. As they delve deeper into the building, they come across a room that seems out of place, a library, its shelves stocked with ancient tomes, the air thick with the must of old paper and decay. The books, bound in strange leathers and inscribed with unfamiliar scripts, seem to hum with an unspoken power. Erickson, compelled by a force he doesn't understand, reaches out to touch one of the books. As his fingers brush the spine, the room shudders violently, and a wind whips through the shelves, pages fluttering wildly as if screaming in pain. The team hastily retreats from the library, but the episode leaves them shaken. It's clear that whatever haunts this place is linked to more than just the warlord's deeds. It's ancient, a corruption seated deep within the very ground on which the building stands. As they continue, the building seems to rearrange itself, corridors twisting into impossible geometries, stairs leading nowhere. The team feels increasingly isolated, each turn taking them further from salvation. The darkness is now palpable, a physical presence pushing against them, oppressive and overwhelming. Whispers fill the air, growing louder, a cacophony of voices that are neither human nor comprehensible but filled with malice. Shadows flicker at the edge of their vision, forms half-glimpsed, not fully real but undeniably present, figures of soldiers long dead, victims of the warlord's brutality, their eyes hollow with despair and accusation. Suddenly, the team finds themselves in a vast chamber, far larger than any room should be in such a building. The ceiling arches high above, lost in shadow, and at the center stands a dais with an altar. The air here is cooler, and the voices whisper one word with urgent malevolence: approach. Captain Erickson, despite every instinct screaming against it, steps forward, his team close behind. The altar is covered in dark stains, old blood etched into its stone. As they watch, a shadowy figure materializes, more solid than the others, its features obscured by a tattered military uniform, eyes glowing with a baleful light. It speaks in a language they don't understand, yet the intent is clear: anger, hatred, a thirst for vengeance against all who have desecrated this place. The figure points to the altar, and then to the team, a clear demand. Erikson feels a pull, an inexplicable urge to comply, but resists. He orders his team to retreat, but the way they came is gone, replaced by solid walls. Trapped, they face the spectral figure as it grows in power, the air around it shimmering with dark energy. As they brace for a confrontation, the sound of helicopter blades becomes faintly audible above the supernatural tumult. Extraction is close, but so is a deeper descent into the nightmare. The building rumbles, as if preparing to collapse upon itself and bury them in its dark secrets forever. The story pauses here, with Echo Team caught between the promise of rescue and the escalating supernatural threat, their fate hanging in an uneasy balance amidst the horrors of war and beyond. The spectral figure, now nearly tangible in its menacing presence, advances towards Echo Team with a slow, deliberate malice. Each step it takes leaves a chilling wave in the air, distorting reality around it. The walls of the chamber seem to breathe, inhaling deeply as if feeding on the team's growing terror. Captain Erikson, his resolve hardened against the unearthly threat, signals his team to prepare for an engagement of a different kind, a battle not just for their lives, but for their very souls. They set up a defensive perimeter around the dais, their weapons seemingly inadequate against such a foe, but their military training provides a sliver of hope, a structure amid chaos. The entity speaks again, its voice a cacophony of whispers that fill the chamber like a chilling wind. The words are indecipherable, but their intent cuts through: resentment for the intrusion, a vengeful delight in the fear it instigates. Erikson tries to communicate, shouting over the din of the haunting whispers, asking what it wants, declaring their intent was only to stop the warlord's reign of terror. In response, the figure pauses, its glowing eyes narrowing. The air vibrates with the weight of its contemplation, and then, surprisingly, it shifts its approach. The temperature drops further, a cold so intense it feels as though it could freeze the very marrow in their bones. Instead of advancing further, the figure gestures towards the walls of the chamber, which begin to shimmer and fade, revealing scenes of horrific battles past, soldiers from different eras, trapped in their final, gruesome moments, their pain and anger palpable, echoing through time. This psychic onslaught overwhelms Echo Team. Each member is caught in his own private horror, visions of past regrets, friends lost in battle, and the worst moments of their lives replayed with vivid, cruel clarity. The supernatural entity feeds off their emotional turmoil, growing clearer and more formidable with each passing moment. Despite the mental barrage, Sergeant Lewis, through sheer will, breaks free from his visions. He sees his team struggling, each man ensnared in his own nightmarish loop. With a rallying cry, he attempts to refocus their attention, reminding them of their duty and their bond as soldiers. One by one, they snap out of their trances, shaken but now burning with a renewed, desperate determination. They realize that traditional weaponry is ineffective against such an entity. Instead, they begin to focus on the psychological warfare being waged against them. Captain Erikson, drawing on unspoken strategies, starts to orchestrate a plan that uses their collective willpower and the strong emotional bonds of the team to create a kind of shield, a mental barricade against the horrors being used to sap their strength. As they enact this plan, the entity, sensing the shift in tactics, escalates its assault, the visions becoming more intense, more personal. The walls of the room bleed shadows that creep towards the team, attempting to smother their resolve in physical darkness. Outside, the sound of the approaching helicopter grows louder, a beacon of hope amidst the encroaching gloom. Yet, with every moment that rescue seems within reach, the entity's efforts to keep them there intensify. The room shakes violently, pieces of the ceiling begin to crumble, and a deep crack splits the floor, emitting a blinding light that seems to pulse with malevolent energy. Erikson realizes that their very presence has disturbed something ancient, a force tied not only to the warlord's atrocities but to the ground itself, cursed by centuries of conflict and bloodshed. This realization steels his resolve further. He knows that their fight is not just to escape, but to somehow appease or seal away this vengeful spirit. As the story pauses once again, Echo Team, surrounded by the ruins of the chamber, stands united, their mental barriers just holding against the dark tide. The helicopter is almost there, its lights visible through the cracks in the crumbling walls. But the entity prepares for one final, devastating assault, drawing upon the energy of the land itself, a land scarred by countless wars. The outcome hangs in balance, the air crackling with the impending clash of wills, as Echo Team braces to confront the heart of the haunted battleground. As the helicopter's lights flicker through the fractures in the decaying walls, the spectral entity prepares its final assault, drawing deep from the blood-soaked earth, channeling centuries of violence and despair. The chamber vibrates, stones falling like heavy raindrops, a symphony of destruction playing to the rhythm of impending doom. Captain Erickson, seeing the encroaching danger, shouts orders, trying to marshal his team's flagging spirits. They form a tighter circle around the dais, each man's resolve acting as a bastion against the swelling darkness. Their combined strength creates a palpable energy field, a shimmering barrier of collective willpower. The entity, now a towering figure of shadows and malevolent light, stretches its form to imposing heights, its features a blur of tormented souls it has consumed over the ages. It bellows in a chorus of anguished voices, the sound piercing the soldiers' minds like shards of glass. As it advances, the ground beneath Echo Team cracks open, exposing an abyssal glow that seems to pull at their very essence. Sergeant Lewis, acting on a desperate intuition, grabs one of the ancient tomes from the library shelf that had earlier shaken so violently. He opens it to a random page, the strange script pulsating as if alive. With a defiant cry, he throws the book into the heart of the entity. The effect is instantaneous and electrifying. The script glows blindingly bright, illuminating the chamber with a pure, harsh light. The entity recoils as if struck by a physical blow, its form dissipating momentarily, revealing a glimpse of the world beyond, a peaceful, untouched landscape, starkly contrasting with the chaos inside. Encouraged but exhausted, Echo Team pushes forward, their mental barriers strengthened by the sight. Captain Erickson leads the charge, his voice rallying his men, "Hold the line, hold it for home." The walls of the chamber begin to crumble more rapidly, the reality of the building failing to contain the unleashed energies. The entity, writhing in the radiant light of the ancient script, gathers itself for a final, desperate attack. It surges forward, a tsunami of darkness, its very presence threatening to extinguish the light of the men's souls. But as it moves to overwhelm them, the helicopter descends, its downdrafted gale-force wind, the mechanical roar battling the spectral wails. Pilot over the comm, his voice a lifeline, "Echo Team, we're here. Make it out now." With the last of their energy, the team lunges towards the light of the open helicopter door, each step a battle against the pulling darkness. The entity, sensing its prey escaping, lashes out, tendrils of shadow snatching at their heels. Private Connors, the last in line, feels a cold grip around his ankle. He falls, his face a mask of terror as he's slowly dragged back to the altar. Captain Erickson, already aboard, reaches out, their hands inches apart. In a final, desperate act, Lewis throws another of the glowing tomes at the entity, causing it to falter just long enough for Erickson to grab Connors, pulling him aboard as they lift off. The helicopter ascends rapidly, the building collapsing into itself below, a final roar of defeat echoing up from the depths as the entity is buried under the rubble. As they rise, the team members collapse, their physical and emotional exhaustion overwhelming. As they fly back towards base, the sun begins to rise, casting light over the devastated landscape. Below, the ruins of the building smolder, a tomb now for the vengeful spirit it once housed. Captain Erickson looks back, his eyes weary yet vigilant, knowing the horror was contained, for now. Yet, as the helicopter flies into the dawn, a chill remains among the team. Each man is silent, lost in his own thoughts. The horrors they faced were beyond human comprehension, rooted in the darkest parts of history and human nature itself. The scars they carry are not just from the battle but from the confrontation with a past that refused to die. And in the quiet aftermath, as the world wakes, a lingering question haunts them all: is it truly over, or have they merely postponed a darker reckoning? The story ends here, leaving a sense of uneasy closure, the horrors of the past momentarily at bay, but the shadow of future threats looming large. In the small, quaint town of Willow's End, a legend whispered through the halls of the old Victorian school, now used as a community center, had kept children and adults alike wary of mirrors in dimly lit rooms. The legend of Bloody Mary was not just a ghost story here, it was a deeply ingrained part of the town's history, rooted in the tragic tale of Mary Worthington, a woman who had lived in the town during the late 1800s and met a gruesome end that left her spirit allegedly bound to mirrors. The story begins with Nathan, a skeptical high school student and budding filmmaker, who decided to make a documentary about local legends for a school project. Driven by curiosity and a desire to prove the stories wrong, he enlisted the help of his friends, Jenna, an aspiring actress, Tyler, the tech-savvy gadgeteer, and Sarah, who had a keen interest in paranormal activities. One evening, as the autumn winds began to stir, Nathan and his crew set up their equipment in the former school's main hallway, where a large, ornate mirror, known as Mary's Mirror, hung. This mirror was said to be the portal through which Mary's vengeful spirit communicated with the living. According to local lore, if one stood before the mirror in a dimly lit room and chanted Bloody Mary 3 times, her spirit would appear in the reflection and cause madness or death to those who dared to summon her. With cameras rolling and lights dimmed to just above a flicker, Nathan, trying to maintain a tone of mock seriousness, dared to invoke Mary's name. "Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary," he intoned, staring into the glass while Jenna held a handheld camera to capture any anomalies. At first, nothing happened. The group's laughter echoed off the walls, filling the silence that followed Nathan's chant. However, as they were about to turn on the lights, the temperature in the hallway plummeted, and the mirror's surface seemed to fog over from within. A face, twisted in a silent scream, slowly appeared, causing Jenna to drop the camera in shock. The electronic equipment malfunctioned, lights flickered wildly, and a high-pitched shriek filled the air, overwhelming the crew's screams. Panicking, they fled the building, leaving behind their equipment. Outside, breathing heavily, Nathan tried to rationalize the occurrence as a trick of the light or a technical glitch, but the fear in Jenna's eyes told a different story. She had seen something in the mirror, a glimpse into a world beyond their understanding. Determined to debunk the phenomenon and retrieve their expensive equipment, Nathan convinced the group to return the following night. This time, armed with more lights and a new camera, they entered the building, the weight of their previous encounter hanging over them like a dark cloud. As they approached the mirror, an overwhelming sense of dread gripped them. The hallway was colder than before, the air thick with anticipation. Nathan, his confidence shaken but his curiosity piqued, repeated the chant, his voice a mix of fear and defiance. This time, the manifestation was immediate and terrifying. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and the face of Bloody Mary emerged, more distinct and horrifying than before. Her eyes, hollow and deep, locked onto Nathan's, and an unbearable sorrow filled the room. Then, the mirror cracked, a single, jagged line running down its center, and a blood-curdling scream escaped from its depths, echoing through the empty halls. The crew, frozen in fear, watched as dark, inky tendrils snaked out from the broken mirror, reaching for them with a palpable hunger. Sarah, the bravest among them, snapped out of the trance and shouted for everyone to run. They sprinted down the hallway, the sounds of shattering glass and Mary's anguished screams chasing them. Escaping into the night, they didn't stop running until they reached Nathan's car, parked a block away. Inside, they tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. It was clear now that the legend was no mere story, it was a warning. Mary's spirit was not just a trapped soul, it was something darker, a force that fed on fear and sorrow. As they debated their next move, realization dawned on them that the events of the night would not simply fade away. The mirror had been a prison, and they had broken it. Now, Mary was free to roam. The story pauses here, with the group grappling with the consequences of their actions. Nathan's skepticism had been shattered, replaced by a terrifying certainty. They had unleashed something upon Willow's End, something that had been bound for over a century. And now, they were directly in its path. As the night deepens and the winds howl outside, a creeping fog envelopes the town, carrying with it whispers of the past and the chilling laughter of a woman scorned, her vengeance as cold and relentless as the grave. As the fog thickened, swallowing the streets of Willow's End, Nathan and his friends knew they couldn't just leave the town to fend for itself against the malevolent force they had unleashed. They decided to seek help from the only person in town who might know how to contain or even stop Bloody Mary, Mrs. Whitmore, the local historian and librarian, who was an expert on the town's folklore. Driving through the nearly impenetrable mist, their headlights barely cut through the gloom. The town, usually quaint and welcoming, now seemed foreign and menacing, its familiar landmarks obscured by the thick fog and an unsettling quiet. When they reached Mrs. Whitmore's house, the old Victorian structure loomed like a ghost from the haze, its windows dark. After a few tense knocks, the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Whitmore, her expression grave. She had been expecting them, she said, or someone like them. The history of Bloody Mary was cyclical, always repeating with new faces and old horrors. Inside her study, surrounded by ancient books and artifacts, Mrs. Whitmore explained the origins of the curse. Mary Worthington had been a healer in the town, wrongfully accused of witchcraft and brutally executed. Her last words had been a curse on those who had condemned her, promising that vengeance would be hers through reflections and shadows. The only way to possibly reverse the curse was to find the original mirror from which she had first been summoned, the one that hung in the old schoolhouse over a century ago. Unfortunately, that mirror was now shattered, its pieces scattered. To bind Mary's spirit once again, they would need to collect all the fragments and reassemble the mirror in the very spot where she had been condemned. Armed with this knowledge and a heavy sense of responsibility, Nathan and his crew set out to gather the fragments. Each piece of the mirror seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, and with each shard they collected, the temperature would drop, and the wind would moan, as if protesting their efforts. As the night deepened, their task grew more perilous. The town itself seemed to turn against them, with paths mysteriously shifting and familiar streets leading to dead ends. Shadows moved at the corner of their eyes, and reflections in windows and puddles seemed to twist into sinister visages, watching, always watching. The group felt Mary's presence growing stronger with each fragment they recovered. Whispers filled the air, a litany of accusations and threats, spoken in Mary's voice. "Return what you've taken," it hissed, "or suffer for eternity." Despite the terror clawing at their minds, they pressed on, driven by the need to make things right. Halfway through their quest, as they approached an old, abandoned part of town to retrieve one of the larger fragments, the full force of Mary's wrath was unleashed. The ground beneath them trembled, and a thick, otherworldly mist enveloped them, isolating each from the other. They could hear each other's distant shouts but couldn't find their way back to each other. Nathan found himself alone, clutching a bag of mirror shards. The fog around him swirled with malicious intent, and Mary's face appeared and disappeared within it, her eyes filled with rage and sorrow. "Why do you resist?" she whispered, her voice a blend of sadness and malice. "Join me in the shadows. Find peace in the darkness." Fighting the paralyzing fear, Nathan pushed through the mist, calling out for his friends. One by one, he found them, disoriented but unharmed. Together again, they found the large shard, guarded as if by the spirits of the town's dark past, shadows of those who had stood by as Mary was wrongfully condemned. As they secured the last piece, the earth shook violently, a clear sign that Mary did not want to be bound again. They raced back to the community center, the original site of the schoolhouse where Mary's tragic end had occurred. With every step, the wind howled in fury, and the ground seemed to rise against them, as if trying to swallow them whole. Arriving at the center, they began the arduous process of reassembling the mirror. Each shard seemed to resist placement, the edges sharp and unyielding. As they fitted the last piece into place, a silence fell over the town. The wind died down, and the fog began to dissipate. But as they backed away from the completed mirror, they saw Mary's reflection staring back at them, her face contorted not just in anger now, but in desperation. "You cannot trap me again," she screamed, her voice causing the glass to vibrate. The story pauses here, with Nathan and his friends facing the wrath of Bloody Mary, her spirit fighting against the binds they hope to place upon her once more. The mirror stands complete yet unstable, a portal between worlds, holding back a force that threatens to overwhelm them with its vengeful power. As the air vibrates with the intensity of Mary's rage, the ancient wood of the community center groans ominously, the building itself seeming to feel the strain of containing such a malevolent force. Outside, the last remnants of the fog roll back like a curtain, revealing a town eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Inside, Nathan and his friends stand rigid, their eyes fixed on the mirror. They watch, horrified, as cracks begin to spider web across the surface, the structure threatening to shatter under the spiritual tumult it contains. Jenna, her voice trembling, suggests they perform a sealing ritual Mrs. Whitmore mentioned, one that might reinforce the mirror's hold over Mary. With no better options and time running out as the mirror's integrity fails, they hastily gather the necessary materials scattered around the old schoolhouse: candles, chalk for a protective circle, and salt believed to purify and protect against evil spirits. As they lay out the materials and begin the ritual, the temperature drops sharply, their breath visible in the icy air. Each word of the chant they recite seems to echo through the hall, mingling with the whispers of the wind that slips through the cracks in the building. Mary's image in the mirror writhes as if in pain, her screams silent but palpable, reverberating through the glass and into their very bones. Tyler, who handles the technical aspects, sets up cameras to record what they hope will be the final confrontation, his hands shaking as he adjusts the lenses. Sarah, ever the researcher, recites the words from the ritual with a focused intensity, her eyes never leaving the mirror. The candles flicker as if struggling to stay lit against a cold that seeps into everything, an unnatural chill that threatens to extinguish the light they desperately need. As they close the circle, sealing themselves inside with the mirror, the air inside the barrier warms slightly, a sign that the ritual might be working. Nathan, taking a deep breath, approaches the mirror, his reflection alongside Mary's tortured visage. He speaks directly to her, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. "Mary, we know what was done to you was wrong, but this has to end. You've suffered long enough, and so have the innocent people of this town. Let us help you find peace." For a moment, the air stills, and Mary's image in the mirror clears, her expression one of immense sadness. Then, just as quickly, it contorts into rage, the mirror vibrating violently as she shrieks a denial that sends shards of glass flying towards the protective circle. The group ducks instinctively, the barrier holding just barely as the glass fragments clink harmlessly off an invisible shield. Heart-pounding, Nathan continues the ritual, his friends joining in, their voices a united front against the darkness that seeks to escape. With each verse of the chant, the light within the circle grows brighter, the mirror's reflection becoming less distinct, Mary's form dissolving into a blur of light and shadow. The howling wind reaches a crescendo, a deafening roar that drowns out their voices, but they do not falter, their words carrying power as they cling to the ritual as their last hope. As the ritual nears its completion, the building itself reacts. The walls tremble, dust and debris falling from the ceiling as if the very foundation resists the containment of such a force. But amidst the chaos, a clarity settles over Nathan and his group. They see their town through the glass, calm and peaceful, as if awaiting liberation from a long-endured nightmare. The story pauses here, with the ritual incomplete and the battle reaching its peak. Nathan and his friends stand firm, their resolve unbroken despite the physical and supernatural forces railing against them. The mirror, now barely holding together, pulses with the energy of a storm contained, the fate of Mary, the town, and the group hanging in an uncertain balance. The night stretches on, the outcome undecided, the silence of anticipation heavy in the air, broken only by the sound of their determined voices echoing through the hall. The confrontation with Bloody Mary teeters on the edge of resolution or disaster, the next moment's critical in determining whether peace or perpetual torment will prevail.